All right, so welcome. My name is Emilie Tweardy. I'm with Appalachian Sustainable Development. I'm an agroforester. I've got my colleague Stesh Warren here. You want to say hello, Stesh?
Greetings, everyone. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, Stesh is going to be handling any tech glitches and fielding the chat and the Q&A. And then, of course, our extra special guest, Dr. John Fike, is with us. And he's given me permission to just call him John. So I'm going to stick with John for the evening. And we're going to be hearing from him extensively in just a minute. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and do a little bit of intro, and then I'll hand it over to John. All right. Well, welcome to the Ask an Agroforester webinar series. This is our second session, and these will all be recorded. We are recording right now, so just, another little recording warning, we're recording. And these will get posted on the ASD YouTube page or YouTube channel once we are all edited up and ready to go. But you see myself and Sesha are here from ASD. Those are our email addresses. If you have anything you'd like to reach out to us about, feel free. We just love emails. Who doesn't love emails? But tonight we're talking about forages and silvopasture systems. And this is going to be a really great session. We're going to talk about introducing John in just a minute. But first of all, where we're headed right now, we're into this welcome and webinar info. And then we're going to talk a little bit about ASD, just who we are. And then we'll have our guest presenter speak. And then we've got the majority of our time is in Q&A, and that's going to be split into two parts. Half of that Q&A is the questions that y'all submitted ahead of time. And we've got a really great roster of questions. So thank you so much, everybody who helped add to that. And then the second half is the live Q&A. So those who are here tonight and have additional questions, we can get those answered. All right. So just a little bit about ASD. We are Appalachian Sustainable Development, living better locally. Our mission is to build a thriving regional food and agriculture system that creates healthy communities, respects the planet, and cultivates profitable opportunities for Appalachians. So if you want to check us out, definitely visit our website and go to the agroforestry page. If you hit programs, you can see a list of all our awesome programming. The agroforestry page is right there. And then also you can see right below that, two down from that, is the Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And that's where you would find that page as well. So some of the services we offer that might be relevant to this crowd, we offer agroforestry technical assistance. We offer assistance in forest farming, alley cropping, and silvopasture. And we've been around for 25 years, and the agroforestry program has been around for the last 10 years, I think. And then we started offering technical assistance in 2017. So we're really proud to be able to offer these services to folks. Sometimes that's just a resource share. Sometimes that's actually visiting the property. Like sometimes we do site visits. We also do, phone calls, meetings, help hook people up with other folks in the network, you name it. So you can fill out an application for technical assistance, and we have all kinds of free services we can offer you. And that has also expanded recently to the maple woodlot assessment. So that's for folks in Appalachia who are interested in producing maple products and are not sure how to get started with that. We are also participating in the Edwards Mother Earth Foundation Train the Trainer program. This is a really, really great program that we're super excited about because, as y'all have noticed, and probably some of the reason you're here, is that there's a lot of high-level agroforestry information out there, and there's really not a lot of good, detailed, on-the-ground how-to information. It's part of the reason we have this series going. This Train the Trainer program is meant to address that specifically at the level of folks who are doing teaching and training already. So this is for natural resources professionals that want to really understand these topics more in depth so that they can really go out and give the best information they can to the people they work with. So we're going to be offering programs in alley cropping, silvopasture, forest farming, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And yeah, we don't yet have a live registration for this, but on the agroforestry page, if you scroll down, there's a place where you can sign up for email alerts for when that registration is live. And the course is launching in May, and then we've got in-person workshops listed on the dates here. And so you can check those out. And then the Appalachian Harvest Herb Hub that we spoke about a minute ago. It's a really great program. It's a really great facility that we have in Duffield, Virginia. It basically allows folks to come use like shared processing equipment to bring their herbs and get them all cleaned, washed, dried, dehydrated, sometimes pulverized and powdered and shredded or whatever it needs to happen to, make that root into tea or tincture or whatever. And you can do that on the shared use equipment, and we can also help you. We also help aggregate multiple growers so that we can fill larger orders and get you to a larger market. And we do trainings and cost share and all kinds of great stuff. So if you're an herb grower and you're within, maybe 3 hours of Duffield, definitely check out the Herb Hub. And then lastly, we've got more webinars coming up. So we don't have one next week, but the following Tuesday, we've got a Propagating Trees from Seed session with Sean Dombrowski of Edible Acres. So we're really looking forward to that. And then as you can see, we've got even more great stuff coming. So thanks for being here on the early end, and I hope you'll stick with us. All right, before we head into our Forages in Silvopasture system with Dr. Fike, we are going to do a poll. So this is going to help us know who's in the crowd. So basically, we're just, wondering what your background is, and that'll help give John a little bit of an idea who he's speaking to, and it also is necessary metrics tracking for our grant funding. So please participate. All right. So I'm going to share these results so that y'all can see. We've got about 47% farmers, and looks like one natural resource professional, and then some folks that are also both. And I'm not sure what the other is. I don't have my chat open since I'm screen sharing. I don't know if you all want to share that. We'd love to hear what kind of stuff you're getting into. All right, and that takes us to the part where I can stop talking and John can start talking. All right, so we're about to hear from John. Bio-wise, John Fike's a professor in Virginia Tech School of Plant and Environmental Sciences, and also Virginia State Forage Extension Specialist. So he is ideally placed for our session this evening. He grew up on a small, successful family dairy farm in Franklin County, Virginia. And after completing his BS in science education, he spent a period of time in global travel, which I would love to hear more about someday, including work on grazing dairies in New Zealand, which is super interesting. He pursued a master's in forage agronomy at Tech and a PhD in dairy science at U Florida. Since he joined the faculty at Virginia Tech in 2000, John is engaged in diverse research efforts, including biomass for bioenergy crops and industrial hemp. So really cool stuff. He's doing all kinds of different things. His primary efforts, however, are with forages and forage livestock systems, and he has long-standing research and extension efforts with Silvopastures. And I can tell you firsthand that as an agroforester, whenever I'm looking for anything in Silvopasture research related, I almost guarantee that John Fike's name is going to come up somewhere on it. And if not, he's maybe 1 degree away from it, or maybe 2 degrees at max. But he's well connected and really knows what's going on in this field and has been doing it for a while. And also, just on a personal note, John's the kind of guy who, even though he's super busy, he gets about 1,000 emails a day, he'll always add something personal into his emails, which is very nice. So, John, I'll let you speak here in just a second, but just as a prompt, if you'd like to just share with us where you've been in agroforestry, where you are now, and where you're headed, and then if you could hop into your presentation, that would be great.
Well, where have I been? We've just come through Easter. I guess I was for a while feeling kind of like John the Baptist crying out in the wilderness or whatever, talking about these systems and thinking that they have some real potential. And most people look at me like I was crazy. But the tides have changed a little bit, and more and more people seem to be getting interested. And again, I think it's I don't know if it's a testimony to any great success that I've had, or just my stubborn persistence, or whatever. But as we look at opportunities to address climate issues, as we look at the needs for animal welfare and that sort of thing, more people are starting to take a look at silvopastures. I wouldn't say that we're getting huge rates of adoption, but certainly things like the Edwards Mother Earth Foundation grant and some new funding that's coming along, I think will help support some greater uptake of the practice. And as that moves forward, what's my role in that? I guess I will continue to work on the extension side to try to promote the systems, what I think the potential benefits are, and to continue to do research within the systems, just to think in terms of how do we, get the best that we can out of them. It's not all excuse me, got a little frog here. It's not all sweetness, light, and rainbows, I think, from my perspective. And I don't want to characterize it that way. We managed for simplicity, for a reason, because it's easy. But nature doesn't necessarily work that way. And I guess I would encourage us to think more about management in a kind of a holistic sense, as opposed to just simplifying all the systems and making it easy for ourselves. Like, you got to spray for that. No, maybe, but anyway, I don't want to get too lost in those weeds, Emily. So let's see what I can do here relative to sharing the screen.
Yeah, let's jump into it.
Let's go with this one. I'll take this oops, I do that. Take it a second, I think, to get up to presentation view. That's what I get for having. Are you going? There we go. How's that?
That's good. Your full screen looks great.
Yeah. So this is an image, and it probably, for a talk on forage species for silvopastures, it probably looks pretty rank and coarse. This is what you can see here in the front are honey locust trees as part of our research site. Right here in the very foreground is a black walnut tree. Those are the primary species, or those are the species with which I've done pretty much all of my forage livestock research with silvopastures. These were planted in 1995 by a colleague in forestry who retired several years ago. Anyway, without belaboring the point, just that gives you some sort of sense of what my setting looks like sometimes as we get into the end of spring and systems are going dormant. And in this case, that year, we didn't have any animals grazing the system. So I wanted to start with this. As I think about putting together silvopasture, we need to think about this in the context of systems. Systems have to be managed with some understanding of soil, plant, and animal components. And in the context of silvopasture systems, we're adding trees. And so now we have an animal tree interaction. We have a tree grass interaction. And so, the level of complexity just goes up when we add other organisms into the system, or certainly can. And then, there's also this issue of climate and management. So this evening, I'm going to address the group primarily from the standpoint of what happens in the mid-Atlantic. But I thought it would be useful just to show you this USDA plant hardiness zone. Let's see, I gotta make sure my cursor's in the right spot. We're in Virginia, largely in this transition zone. As we move east in the state, we'll see more warm season grasses naturally occurring in our forage systems. A lot of time that will be introduced warm season species like Bermuda grass or Dallas grass. We also have a lot of native warm season grasses. Some are not necessarily so desirable, like broom sedge, but we have plenty that are desirable as well. There may be some in this audience who have connections to Ohio and parts further north, and so I'll probably speak to that a little bit. I'm not going to talk so much about the forage species that you would be likely to find in the warm season dominant zones. I'll just say that that's largely in kind of forage systems context, that's largely Bahia grass or Bermuda grass. Those are both introduced species. There are a number of other warm season species, both introduced and natives, that are used in the warm season dominant zone. And in some cases, you get a little bit of both. So, trying to figure out how do I manage all that relative to trees and that sort of thing can be a little bit more tricky. I won't, again, spend much time talking about this kind of part of the world in terms of silvopasture. So thinking about this in a Virginia or mid-Atlantic context, we have a number of cool season and warm season forages that we would rely on. Kentucky bluegrass, orchard grass, tall fescue, white or ladino clover, red clover, yada, yada, yada. I mean, there's a number of these. And when we think about putting it together forage systems, I most typically lean to the cool season grasses. I do that, and cool season forages to include clovers. I do that because cool season species are what we would call light saturated at about 50% full sun. Now, that's kind of at an individual leaf level. I'll explain that later. But what that means is that they can't use all the sunlight that is reaching the Earth's surface. And so adding trees into the system is not necessarily a negative thing, because the trees can capture some portion of the sunlight. And if we can keep it on balance of about 50% full sun reaching the understory, we'll keep productivity right up there with our normal level of productivity as in an open site. So thinking about species, the first one I'm going to start with in the mid-Atlantic is going to be tall fescue. And fescue, we turn to that for a variety of reasons. It's persistent. And it's adaptable to a variety of managements. It's nutritious. It's excellent for stockpiling, which is a way of holding the forage over and deferring the grazing until some later period of time. It holds up quite well. And there are a number of varieties, but I would be remiss if I didn't talk just a little bit about endophyte issues, because tall fescue is probably going to be our predominant species throughout the mid-Atlantic. And most of what we have is a variety called Kentucky 31, and it contains an endophyte, that is a fungus. Endo is within and phyte is plant, so it's fungus within the plant is the endophyte. And that fungus causes real problems. But it's also led to the spread of this grass. It is the most widely planted cool season forage, in North America. And we are smack dab here in the middle of what we would call the fescue belt. This is kind of that transition zone, if you recall that, between the north and the south. You don't see a lot of forage systems with fescue in the deep south. It can grow there, but it's not particularly productive. So why do we have it? Again, the endophyte is within that plant, and it conveys a lot of agronomic benefits. If you look on the right, this is the plant without the endophyte, and this is the same plant with endophyte. The only problem is that tall fescue with this toxic endophyte produces toxins, or actually the endophyte produces toxins that have a lot of problems for livestock. And this is just an example of that. The take-home message from all of this, and I'm probably spending more time than I should, but the take-home message for all of this is if you're going to start a new silvopasture, and you're going to, or a new pasture for that matter, and you're going to plant cool season perennial forages, fescue is probably at the top of your list. And I just want to say, emphasize, encourage you to plant novel fescue. The novelty in that is it has an endophyte, but it is an endophyte that was selected for its lack of toxin production. So these are animals that are on the endophyte or on toxic fescue. It's got an endophyte that's producing toxins. You can see they're stressed. That's why so many of our animals are in streams during the summertime. And these animals are on novel fescue. So if fescue is your choice, go with novel. Orchard grass would be one that most people would think about in the context of a temperate zone silvopasture. It's productive, it's nutritious, it's not as productive in the summer in an open site, but it does quite well in an orchard-like setting. So, that's a good one. It just works quite well relative to lower light levels. Red clover is reasonably shade tolerant, but it's, what legumes are we going to work with? If we're thinking about introduced species, red clover is probably going to be one of the ones that comes to the fore. White clover, we see a lot of white clover actually in our silvopasture systems, but it's not particularly productive in those systems. So I think part of what happens sometimes is that if because of shading, forage production is down a little bit, these species spread out on the ground a bit. And when they do that spreading out, they're capturing light, right? So I think that's partly why we see some of that, but it's not necessarily one that I would recommend, but that's for silvopasture system right off the bat. So I just try to get a little bit of research to back up some of what I'm talking about. Number of years ago at the University of Missouri, they did a pot study. So they just took pots and they planted them. They used different shade levels and they looked at the productivity. And what you'll notice is that there are some differences by variety, say within orchard grass. Not a whole lot of difference for this variety called Justice, whereas Benchmark, which is an older variety, it dropped off a bit in the shade. Kentucky bluegrass was reasonable at higher shade levels. So I probably should define this. The first column is full sun, 50% shade and 80% shade using shade cloth. Smooth brome grass is another one that's actually quite productive with shade. In fact, with 50% shade, it was more productive than the full sun or in the 80% shade. And there was some differentiation among these tall fescue varieties, but tall fescue doesn't like deep shade, quite frankly. Another species that was not evaluated at that time and has been looked at more closely in pasture systems probably since the mid-aughts or maybe 2010s or whatever since then, and that's meadow fescue. And some of those varieties do have high levels of shade tolerance. They don't grow so well at my latitude, but if you're in, say, Ohio or the Midwest, parts north of Virginia, meadow fescue might be a good one to consider adding to a system. That same study, they also looked at warm season grasses. You can see Bermuda grass. So if you're further south, Bermuda really tanks in a high shade environment. And they didn't look at Bahia grass. It doesn't grow very well in Missouri. So I think that was part of the reason why they didn't bother with it. The native warm season grasses also are not particularly shade tolerant, although, these are reasonably productive in that environment. But you have to consider how much of the year am I going to have this warm season grass growing? Maybe more useful at further south or more southern latitudes. Another native grass they did not evaluate is eastern gamma grass, also fairly shade tolerant. Then they looked at a number of legumes, and you can see some differentiation here. Where was the red clover? Again, fairly productive in the moderate shade, but it drops off a fair amount once you get to the heavy shade sites. And in their case, the white clover, neither one of these were specified by variety. The white clover was actually reasonably productive at that high level of shade. One of the things that, I guess I doubled myself up here. One of the things I was interested in, and I'll come back to this, some of these warm season annuals like Korean Lespedeza, you see that they drop off significantly in the shade. But if we're thinking about starting a silvopasture, there may be a place for some of these species at that early stage of silvopasture development, and we can talk about that in a little bit. The other thing I wanted to point out is there's very little research that have been done with these native warm season legumes, something I've long been interested in. These are things like the tick trefoils, Desmodium canescens, and paniculatum. And you'll notice that they're quite productive under shade. So I think that there, if people that are interested in planting natives, there may be some real opportunities there. But again, lots of questions surrounding that as well. So we did a study in Virginia that was a shade structure study. What we did was we took snow fence essentially and had slatted structures. And there's some other literature that says, that's a better way to do it than with shade cloth, because you get this kind of light and light shade through the day, kind of modeled patterns. And so this is, let's see if I can do this right. So 2015 production through the totality of 2015, and this is the increasing shade level. And you can see that we're a little bit more than 30% shade. That was as or more productive than the higher shade levels. In 2016, this is a second year of growth for these plants. Same kind of picture, more productive as these grasses are more mature. But I wanted to break this out a little bit. We tested simple mixtures and some complex and intermediate mixtures. I just want to show you some plant responses with the simple and the complex mixtures. First of all, this dot represents the production of tall fescue. And again, we're here at the 50% shade level. And what you see is that we were about maxing out forage production when we had a mixture of tall fescue and white clover. See, the white clover was never a very big part of the sward. But we had the highest production of tall fescue at about 50% shade. The other kind of interesting thing here is that these were planted kind of into an open field, and then the shade structures were put in place. And when we had lots of, in the open sites, we had a fair amount of weed presence within the sward that first year. But the weed presence drops with shading. So, some benefit to having that shade. The other thing here is, so looking at 2016, you can see the white clover does not respond very well to the shade. And the tall fescue, again, is maximizing probably at 50%, or actually did pretty well at 70% shade in year 2 when it was a more mature plant. This is the complex mixture. It had, along with tall fescue, again, the dots. We also had orchard grass. And look who's more productive here. The orchard grass did better in that site. And the interesting thing about this is that orchard grass, this site was in the southern Piedmont, and orchard grass would not be expected to be as productive at that part of the state because it's hotter and it's a harder site for orchard grass. But under the shade, the orchard grass was competitive. You'll notice the red clover did fairly well at kind of these moderate levels of shade, but it tends to play out at the higher shade level. So I like to show this. This is not red clover. This is white clover, and this is my daughter many long years ago. But this is a house where we used to live, and you can see we have lots of violets underneath the tree. The violets tolerate the shade. The white clover doesn't like the shade so much. And I think that's what you'll see in silvopastures. You're going to have less of some of these more desirable species. Some questions that were asked about, how do you get some of this stuff established, particularly if I'm working in among trees? This is kind of a set of interesting pictures that I got from Brett Chedzoy, who's up in New York. He does what he likes to call bale bombs, and he brings in mature hay that's got seed in the hay itself, and then those animals do the work of getting those grass seed distributed for him. Recently, I've had somebody contact me and said, look, I'm having some problems trying to get silvopasture established in a wooded site, because as I thin it a little bit, he said, I'm seeing stilt grass and other invasive species. And I don't have a whole lot that I can go on in terms of commenting about that. But, I think in this kind of situation where you have disturbance and you have nutrients, and then you have some mulching effect, as it were, from some of this hay, Brett talks like this has worked well for him as a way to establish silvopasture in his part of the country. I mentioned natives earlier. And, that the warm season grasses tend to be challenged in shaded environments, although that may vary by species. This is a stand of switchgrass, and you can see it's somewhat spotty. This is in North Carolina in the coastal plain. Switchgrass is not a species that I would recommend as a general rule for silvopastures, because it likes lots of light and it likes lots of heat. And one thing that might have been done differently here is maybe to have a single rosette instead of a double rosette with a little wider alley. So I think there are ways to accommodate warm season grasses in these systems, but you have to think about, what's that going to mean in terms of trees, stocking density, and that sort of thing. Just a couple of images of other people's efforts in Virginia. This is a thinned pine and hardwood stand in central Virginia, sort of our northern Piedmont. And this producer has, I guess, some forestry equipment. He goes in and just thins individual stems. This is a different approach altogether. This producer had a stand of pines, and he went in and left a couple rows of pines and then put in about a 50-foot alley. And again, this is largely a fescue clover type of system, and he's going to get a fair amount of light into this. A number of studies, I should add this real quickly, a number of studies thinking about silvopastures have planted an east-west tree row orientation. But at our mid-latitudes here in North America, we're probably better to have north-south orientation, because that allows more light in over the course of the day. Now, that's not, sometimes you can't do that. And one of my farmer friends says, look, you just have to work with what you got. And so that may or may not be a possibility for you. If you're planting, so these are some data from Ho et al. Or Hu et al. I'm not exactly sure how they say that name. It's a work from Missouri, and they were looking at if they were planting trees, how much do they need to control the vegetation around it? Somebody had asked this question about this deep-rooted tall fescue. It's very competitive with trees. Yeah, it is competitive with trees. And so if you're planting into a fescue field, you do want to control that vegetation. And what they had done was they planted trees into the system, and they looked at height and stem diameter, and then they kept the vegetation around the tree down at 0.3 meters or 0.6 meters or 0.9 meters. So that's about 0.9 meters. Let's just call that a yard or 3 feet, and so on. And what you saw is that stem diameter was larger after this first year of planting. It's from 4 millimeters with no vegetation control, all the way up to about 8 millimeters when you've got about a 3-foot radius all the way around that tree. And didn't really affect the height in year one, but these are not very tall, right? This is 0.25 meters, so whatever that is, a quarter of 3 feet. So not very much. In year two, however, these trees are, getting close to 3 feet tall, at least some of the tallest ones. And in this kind of area of about 0.9, 1.2 meters, or again, about a yard, you had the highest level of height and the biggest stem diameter. And more control beyond that really didn't help much. But if you can kind of keep 3 feet off of the tree, so vegetation free or some kind of vegetative cover that's not very productive, that can be very helpful. Is there a management opportunity here? So this is a farm up in the Valley of Virginia, and they've planted trees. This is, I don't know, year one or year two after they planted. Lots of vegetation in here. And, this cow can get in and do some of the trimming. But one of the thoughts that I've not actively pursued from a research perspective is, early in the stage of these sites, you could plant something like an annual Lespedeza, something that would be productive in the summertime. And it would also be something that, let's see, if this cow's got a calf, that calf could get underneath the wire and graze that very nutritious forage and help keep the competition down, as it were, the Lespedeza is not going to be particularly competitive. And then over time, as these trees grow and start to shade, the Lespedeza would give way to other species, or, and you could assist that process. So that's all I'm going to say directly about forages for silvopasture systems. It's probably grossly inadequate, but I think Emilie's got lots of questions for me anyway. So
I would not categorize that as grossly inadequate. I think that was an excellent 15 minutes of jam-packed information. So thank you.
More than 15, I think. So I'm sorry about that.
Hey, it's all good. Okay. Before we hop into the questions we have for you, we're going to do our quick fire round of just, shaking stuff up. So I'm going to ask John questions, and he's got about 10 to 15 seconds to answer. What is your favorite thing about academia?
I like interacting with people from all stripes, and that's fair enough.
Least favorite?
The bureaucracy.
Fair enough. Low-hanging fruit there. Favorite thing about working in extension?
Interacting with people.
Yeah.
And let me stop here, Emilie. This
Please.
is the one of the things about silvopasture that has been so compelling for me is that I get to work with people that I wouldn't work with otherwise. I mean, I have a much broader palette, as it were, of colleagues and people to interact with, because we're thinking about more than just, a single crop productivity sort of function or feature.
Mm-hmm.
Working with foresters and conservationists and, all the people that are interested and intrigued by these agroforestry systems has just been a real blessing for me.
Yeah, that's great now. Thank you for sharing that. What is something you don't ever leave home without? For me, it's sunglasses. Like, I can't go out without them.
Well, I was thinking about clothes. I've left my wallet and my keys, but I have been known to wander around the backyard without a shirt or that sort of thing. So, yeah, probably my hair. How about that?
You don't have any worldly attachments?
No, my wedding ring, I think, stays on all the time.
Yeah.
I'm not a flash kind of guy.
Yeah. Who do you think, if anyone, is your celebrity doppelganger? Session, I have an answer to this, but I'm curious.
Gosh, people have called me John Kerry.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
People have called me Hugh Grant. I was like, I don't have blue eyes. I don't have any clue what you're talking about. So I have no clue who is my celebrity doppelganger.
I'm going to say at a distance of like 40 yards, it's Kevin Bacon. Not 40 yards, 40 feet. It's Kevin Bacon.
Okay. Well, my sister says every time she watches Seinfeld, she thinks of me. So really? Okay. I think people need their vision checked. That's what I think.
All right. We'll start getting into some forage questions here. Give the people what they want. All right. So in this section, I'm just going to go through a bunch of the questions that were submitted. We'll try to cover as much as we can. So I get to kind of be the voice of the people here. But first, do you have any upcoming projects that you want to share while we have a second? Anything you need to tell us about that's particularly exciting in this realm?
Yeah. So I've got several projects to tell you about. So, and some of these are forages specific. They're not necessarily silvopasture specific. One, I'm working on a project related to bale grazing. That's been in the works for a little over a year now. And I will be looking for collaborating producers in Virginia in the next year, actually the next couple of years. Two, I am on 3 climate smart grants. Two of them are forage system oriented or specific. but they have a number of potential management practices within them to include silvopasture. The third one, a Climate Smart grant, is an agroforestry specific project, and that one. Well, all of these are just getting off the ground, but there will be opportunities, I think, to incentivize producers to engage in some of these practices. And then another grant that we just got. I'm sitting here saying, "What happened to your sanity?" But another grant that we just got is a grant specifically for silvopastures and to help support silvopasture implementation. And that is one that ASD is involved with, and also a group called Working Trees that has some interesting technology for measuring tree production in these systems and trying to help democratize the carbon market, as it were. So that's a lot with very little specificity. But yeah, I've got a lot on my plate, and much of it has some level of silvopasture component to it.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. So we've got these questions kind of batched by rough topical order. So we've got just a couple more general ones. So we'll start off with a hard hitter. Can you summarize the body of research on the impact of silvopasture on productivity and weight gain? And the caveat is with the understanding that it is still somewhat nascent.
Can I summarize it?
Yep.
So you were asking, that's a different talk. I could have given you some of that. We have some interesting data that shows greater animal performance in these systems. We have some data that shows there's no difference in animal performance in these systems. At that research site that I showed you, the pastures, silvopastures are all pretty small, so we have to work with sheep. There are data out of Arkansas, old study from the 50s that I often use in presentations that shows how much greater gain there is for animals that have access to shade. And tree shade is better than an artificial shade in that particular study. Cow weights are a little bit better. Calf weights, or actually cow weights are better, perhaps more responsive than calf weights, because calves are smaller and have probably better ability to dissipate heat. There's also some work out of Missouri that I don't know that my colleagues ever really published. I've just seen him do a presentation on it. I spent a little time talking about end-of-fight infected fescue, and that's a real problem for us in the Mid-Atlantic or the fescue belt. And you think, well, let's just get rid of that end-of-fight, and then we don't, there wouldn't be any benefit of shade at that point, right? Because we took care of the problem. But the reality, his data would suggest that there's as big a boost in performance by putting shade into a toxic field as there is in just putting those animals, moving them from toxic and putting them on end-of-fight or novel end-of-fight fescue. So when we have shade on top of novel end-of-fight fescue, at least in his study, the performance is better. Now, there are these trade-offs. If you look at some of the work that was done, a generation or two ago in places like Louisiana, there was a fair amount of work there with Bahia grass or wiregrass systems under a high level of pines. What you would see is, there's production opportunity, and then over time, the forage production is going to decline as the timber stand, the canopy starts to close. And then you can start harvesting that canopy and getting more light back into the system and allowing the trees to grow bigger. And while that's happening, while you've got more forage production, then you have greater opportunity for your livestock. So one thing that you might think about is, well, livestock performance doesn't have to suffer, but the stocking rate itself probably would have to change. If I'm going to have less forage, I might still have a very productive animal. I just maybe can't have as many animals at that time when I've got, a high degree of shade. One other thing I'll mention is that in our systems, with the walnut and honey locust comparisons, walnuts, either by allelopathy affecting clover production and other forages, or by heavy shade, or a combination of the two, and they're generally bigger trees than the honey locust trees, we have less production there. And what we've had to do is lower the stocking rate in those systems. And you say, well, that doesn't sound good. And maybe from that standpoint, it's not. But what happens is those animals, we have fewer animals, they have a little more selectivity. And when you look at total weight gain from the systems, we've had equal gain, even though we had less forage. So the individual animal performance is better. I have fewer animals. You multiply the two against each other, and the total gain is better, or excuse me, is equal.
Equalizes.
So in some years, some years it's rainy, and a lot of people say, well, hey, your trees are competing for water with these forages, and that's shutting you down. Well, no, it's probably not the water issues in many cases. In many cases, it's the light. So years where we've had lots of moisture, we have less light. And so the forages and the silvopastures are less productive just because we have so much cloudy weather. And sometimes, you can have really dry weather, and then, yes, you may have competition. And it gets back to what kind of soils do you have? What's the orientation of the site? I mean, is it facing the south? Is it facing the west and it's getting hammered all afternoon? There's a number of these things to factor into that. So I have not summarized the body of literature, and I will give you the academic answer. It depends.
Absolutely. All right. So next question is, are there any historic or traditional approaches to silvopasture and forage management that you think might be applicable to today's livestock operations?
Well, the answer to that is probably yes. I mean, if you look back to pre-Columbian times in North America, much of the eastern seaboard was savanna. The first peoples, the indigenous, were burning the landscapes to keep grasses in the system. In Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley was full of native grasses, and so some of those practices could be deployed now, and in fact, some of them are. There's one silvopasturalist, however you say that, from Chipley, who has regularly burned in his system. He's got, I think, Bahia grass, maybe Bermuda underneath, loblolly or something like that. And he gets lots of pine needles, and so he would burn that to keep the pine needles down and support the grass productivity. I think in the Appalachian region, probably people, when they were seriously managing, they probably girdled trees that they didn't want and let them die naturally. That may or may not work depending on your risk issues and, hazards from a tree coming down. Excuse me. I have not done a lot of work with native species. I really would like to spend some time thinking about how do we manage these systems with the species that were here in pre-Columbian times. So I go back and talk about those tick trefoils, and there are a number of cool season natives that are perhaps not as productive, but they are nutritious and they are shade adapted, and I think that they may have some potential there. But that's a ways off. So I don't know that I've answered your question, that question very well either. But I think that there are some possibilities. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, those are some good thoughts too. All right, so establishment questions. So specifically, when we're talking about establishing silvopasture by thinning as opposed to planting, what helps most with forest establishment, especially where it is not practical to use a drill, cultivation tools, or cultipacker to ensure good seed to soil contact? And then embedded in this is the second question: are there any forages that are more readily adapted to frost seeding?
Well, legumes are, answer the second question first. Legumes are generally thought to be better for frost seeding than grasses, just because of the nature of the seed. It's easier to get them into the soil. And I think that, my own experience, I've broadcast seed not every month of the year, but I have broadcast seed at all kinds of crazy times and have had stand success. But it gets back to what kind of competition, light issues, that sort of thing do you have? I got accused of a Thanksgiving planting one time. It was not Thanksgiving. It was just early November. And it was not perfect. I went back and thickened it up a little bit later, but, we did get some catch. And so, if you looked at recommendations for planting, they are recommendations based on predicted weather and other conditions. But you can, if you've got the right set of conditions, you can plant and get successful establishment kind of any time. Now, I mentioned, so you're thinking about establishment in places where you have to broadcast. I like to say livestock make terrible land managers, but they're great land management tools. And so if you had to broadcast something in, then bring your cows or whatever livestock you've got back over it and have them do the work of trying to help incorporate those seed, get those seed down into the ground. Is it perfect? No. But it can be very helpful. Old timers back in the day, before they had all kinds of tillage equipment and that sort of thing, it was not uncommon for them to cut down a cedar tree and drag it around. And the cedar trees, just kind of work to rough stuff up and to help get the seed down. So, burning would be another thing that you could do if you had a lot of duff layer, or if you had a system where you could control that. If your trees were a little bit more mature, and had a sufficient bark layer that burning them was not going to be a problem, you wouldn't want to do that with new seedlings or something. But in that kind of setting, you might burn the site and then go back and plant the trees and the forages at the same time. I don't know if that's answered the question completely. If you want to follow up with that, if something I missed, have at it.
No, I think it's good. We've got a lot to roll through. So, and there's just it's not possible to be exhaustive. So we're just going to do our best and play through. When establishing a silvopasture in an existing pasture, do you recommend trying to oversee, diversify, enhance the pasture during install? Or is there an optimal time for that? Thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think it kind of depends on what you've got, and let's just assume you're starting with a tall fescue pasture, and you want to get something in there, right? So my general approach probably would be to use herbicide. I have I'll use a specific example. Buck Holsinger, I mentioned him. I showed a picture from his place. Buck was the first silvopasture, NRCS receiver of NRCS support for silvopasture establishment in the state. So in many respects, he's been the guinea pig and the poster child. And that he was not a big fan of herbicide. And so the first year they took a scalper and turned over all this sod and put his trees in place. And, that had advantages and disadvantages. The advantages were, you cleared, you could see where you're planting, stick a tree in the ground. It's great. Disadvantage, when it came time to keep that space clear, he had these layers of turf that are sitting on the top of the ground, and so very uneven ground surface, and it was hard to move his equipment through and keep some of the vegetation down. Another advantage, disadvantage, or disadvantage, advantage, by turning that sod over, it gave an opportunity to all kinds of undesirables, and particularly thistles, to come up. Now, here's the question: are thistles bad or thistles good? And most people say, well, that's terrible. Well, they're great for butterflies and other things like that. But in the context of silvopasture, I'm not so sure, but what the thistles weren't helpful in sort of camouflaging the trees and keeping, some of the wildlife and stuff away from them. So I think that we have a tendency to get too worked up about species that we think of as undesirable, particularly things like thistles that are, biannual or biennial, whatever. I mean, it was biennials. And, if our stands, if our forage stands are healthy, yeah, we may have some low level of that stuff in there, but that's really probably not going to be a problem as long as we're doing a good job of pasture management across the system. We just don't like the looks of it at the time, and we don't want the seeds spreading across the farm. But again, I think to me that's management. The other thing Buck did is he taught his cows to eat thistles, so that's been less of an issue there for him. So going back to the question of kind of the broader question of diversifying the pasture, I mean, while you're at it, sure, if it works for you, if you've got some legume seeds and you can get them out and frost seed those, or maybe it's chicory or plantain or something like that to add more diversity to the pasture system while you're at it, why not? But I think it all gets back to what we have in terms of resources. I'm going to make my investments in trees or pasture diversity. If I have to make a choice, what do I do?
Let me ask another question that builds onto the one we were just talking about. Someone asked about that bare ground that is created by scalping or using a sod cutter. Do you have recommendations on specific things to plant in a space like that, right around your trees?
Yeah, so I really don't have good research-based answers to that. But that's where I was going earlier with that thought of planting something like so let's say I'm planting trees in February, March, and I've got this area scalped. Then maybe a good thing to throw down would be something like the annual Lespedizas, because that ground's going to warm up quicker, and so maybe I can grow these annuals. I don't think that they're particularly competitive in the way that, say, a warm season annual grass like crabgrass would be. So I think about in crabgrass, the warm season grasses, I should say this, they're less, they're more productive per unit of water input than our cool season species are. And so, I don't, but crabgrasses can be quite aggressive. And so that would not be one that I would recommend. Whereas in a forage context, let's say you got a hay ring feeder somewhere and the cows tore it all up. So throw some crabgrass and some other stuff in there, and that would be fine as a way to quickly heal that spot. But in this context, again, I'd be thinking more like things like Lespediza, and there may be an annual Lespediza, maybe specific about that. And there may be other sort of cool season annual legumes, crimson or things like that could be planted in there. Again, trying to take some care not to plant too close to the trees, just to reduce the competition. But I'm less worried about the competition from something like the Lespediza. Do I have any data to back it up? Sorry, no, but that's just my gut feeling.
That's okay. We're not in academia tonight. We're not going to rack you for data.
Don't tell my boss that.
As far as silvopasture friendly forages in the Southeast, which have the highest nutrient value for livestock? I know that's going to differ per livestock.
Well, yeah, but so again, if you look at cool season forages, they have similar levels of nutritional value. Orchard grass, fescue, they're pretty comparable. Smooth brome grass is probably a little more digestible than orchard grass and fescue, but not quite as productive. Meadow fescue, in our part of the world, less productive, but more nutritious. As you move north, meadow fescue would work well. As you go south, lot of these kind of silvopasture systems are pine-based, and you're likely going to see Bermuda grass or Bahia grass. Bermuda grass is less tolerant of the shade, to my memory, than Bahia grass is. So you would see more Bahia grass probably in some sort of silvopastoral system, say in southern coastal plain or into Florida. And yeah, native warm season grasses, there's not been a lot of work looking at those species in a silvopastoral context. And there is some work looking at nutritional value, but without putting it into that kind of context of shade, it's a little harder to say. One thing I can say, pretty much with many of these forages, while they may lower their productivity in a shaded environment, and this may be true for cool and for warm season grasses, oftentimes the lower temperature environments actually mean that they are less fibrous, or the fiber itself is more digestible. So there can be a nutritional trade-off sometimes, that even though you have, again, this lower productivity, it may be more nutritious.
Interesting. That's cool. Okay, specific question from someone who is trying to establish forages in a new space, so into a thinned silvopasture project. They're planning on seeding permanent forage this fall, but are looking for something to deter the annual summer weeds. So wondering about something that could be used as a cover crop during the summer. We're going to assume Mid-Atlantic. I don't have a specific place to picture.
Yeah. So what would be a reasonable cover? And you may have me stumped there. Well, all right. Here's an example of something that we did. And I don't know if we got lucky or what, and I don't really remember what kind of documentation we've got on this, but we have some silvopastures at the Southern Piedmont AREC, which is in Blackstone, Virginia. So if anybody's out that part of the world and wants to stop by, you can take a look. They are largely hardwood or pine. We have kind of two different types of systems. And the colleague, I was not, leading the charge on this one, but the colleague that established that, I think he planted millet at something of a low rate, and he went ahead and added orchard grass, and I think it was Remington rye, perennial ryegrass, and some other ones. So I had used some of these same varieties, species in kind of a shotgun mix at a research station in the Shenandoah Valley. And so he took some of that same shotgun mix and then planted the millet with it. We wouldn't normally plant our cool season forages in the summertime, and particularly in the Southern Piedmont, but he got or had some success with getting the forages up, growing underneath the millet. Now, my experience with planting fescue under millet or Sudan grass is not so great, because those can, overwhelm the system. Too much shade, or maybe competition for moisture when it's dry weather, that sort of thing. But I think you could, depending on how thick your trees are, you could probably still get some cover this summer with millet or sorghum, Sudan, Sudex, whatever, and just plant that alone, and then come back, clean it up a little bit, come back and plant your cool season species this fall. I don't know how productive it would be, and I probably would plant at a low rate just so that it wasn't so thick. If in fact it comes up well, those plants like light. So I'm trying to remember what we had for.
We've got a little comment in the chat cover from Mark saying that in Florida, it's common to seed Bahia grass with millet, to interseed those two together.
Yeah. Okay.
So All right, we've still got a ton more questions from the pre-submitted questions, like 10 more, but I'm going to open it up to the folks who are here tonight. So folks, you can start throwing questions in the chat, or sorry, not in the chat. Don't throw them in the chat. We're not monitoring the chat for questions. Put them in the questions, the Q&A section. And while I'm giving you all a second to do that, we're going to do another quickfire round. So you grew up on a dairy, presumably drinking a lot of milk. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
You prefer it cold or warm?
I like it cold. I mean,
Yeah.
out of the tank, it was about, 35, 40 degrees or whatever. It was very cold. It was wonderful.
What was the last song that was stuck in your head?
I don't know. The last song that was stuck in my head. Yeah, I don't know. That may be too personal. I'm not going to go there.
That stumped Win too, and I was shocked. I always have songs stuck in my head. Okay, do you have any secret talents? Win had a good one, so you better come up with something.
Do I have any secret talent? Well, I don't know. I don't know if it's a secret talent. I sing okay. I play the tuba.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
The gentleman plays the tuba.
Yeah. I mean, actually, if any of you are in Blacksburg, the Blacksburg String Ensemble is playing concert in May, and I was asked to play. They've got an orchestral version of Bohemian Rhapsody, as it were. So
that's awesome.
I haven't played with a string ensemble before as a tubist, but there we go.
That's great. Okay, so what research gaps do you see for silvopasture that need more focus in future studies?
Yeah, I thought that planting trees in pasture systems was just that's simple, straightforward, and the foresters know all that kind of stuff. And but the more you talk to people and the more you work on this stuff, you think, well, getting trees established up and running well cheaply is an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. I'm sitting here thinking, where's the technology application for some of that stuff? We start using robots to get them in the ground and to protect them, or not to protect them maybe, but to keep the zone around the root zone vegetation free, that kind of stuff. That sounds kind of silly, but I think that there's a lot of question for that, and I kind of kicking myself that I haven't really done more of that. One of the real things that frustrates me in the context of silvopastures is all of our forage breeding work. We do that in plots that are in wide open spaces, no trees, shade whatsoever, because how do you harvest those plots and all that kind of stuff. But it strikes me that there's probably, just looking at the data that I showed earlier from Missouri, there's probably a fair amount of genetic variability within existing forage species, both introduced and native, that would allow us to push these systems further relative to the understored productivity, just stuff that could be more tolerant to shade in that, kind of silvopastoral environment. The other side of that is the tree research. It's going to cost you lots of money, I suppose, to develop trees that, there's a wide variation just in the walnut trees we have at our research site in terms of when they leaf out and when they drop. Mm-hmm. And, so there are, I think, real opportunities. I go to Roanoke and there's there's about half a dozen oak trees. And, there may be some site issues relative to cold drainage or whatever, but the trees, this series of oak trees, they're all the same species. And you can see, definite differences in when they leaf out and when they drop. So I just think, well, there's that kind of work that could be done across all kinds of species for all kinds of environments, both understory and tree, in silvopasture or agroforestry contexts. Then there's opportunities to select for different products from the trees, for root architecture, yada, 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 yada. There's so much opportunity, but who's going to pay for all that? I don't have the answer.
You're not going to pay for it, John?
No, sorry.
All right. Do you have any thoughts on animals foraging tree crops? Example given the honey locust seeds and walnuts in your system.
Yeah, so we fed some sheep some honey locust pods, and they were naive to the pods, and so that didn't work too well. But once they finally learned that they could eat those honey locust pods, they did gain quite well, and there may have been some compensatory gain, because they weren't doing so well to start. But I think the honey locust pods are really good. I mean, um, I think there's a lot of opportunity to incorporate trees from a browse perspective. I didn't show pictures of what Buck does, but he um, has been doing some hinge cuts with limbs, and so that the limb will drop, but it's still attached to the tree. And so then the cows will come in and browse that. And, if they keep going until that limb dies, might put out new leaf tissue.
That's really
And I think
interesting.
there's some real biochemical values in that from the standpoint of what the kind of the leaf chemistry, particularly tannins in the black locust. Our sheep loved a honey locust when we cut. So there was a question somebody asked about planting. The site that I work on was originally planted 40-foot alleys and 8-foot apart, but tree to tree spacing within the row was 8 feet. And then over time, it was thinned back to about a 40 by 40. So all of those honey locust trees that were cut out, sprouts come back and the sheep would just go in. Once they learned they could eat that was the first thing they ate when they were turned into that. Not as productive as some other tree species. So, is that really what you want? Maybe not, but certainly I think had a lot of nutritional value, and they liked it. This is kind of a research question. I think willow might be an opportunity, particularly thinking about contexts of where I've got a stream bank that I want to secure. I might plant willows and let them get up, and then maybe I can come in and flash graze that. They browse the willow, and they don't do so much damage to the bank, and then they're out of there. And the willow is an early flowering plant, which can support some early season pollinator, types, that sort of thing. So, there's a lot of opportunity. I think those systems also present a lot of challenges. I'm not gonna back off of that either, because of just what it takes to get them in place and the management and that sort of thing. But one of the most interesting systems that a guy was looking for honey locusts he was in South Africa, and they have in their environment, the grass, in a Mediterranean environment, the grass dries up, and it's a very low protein, high carbohydrate, fairly digestible, but it's not nutritious enough. And so they were planting rows of what they call was it shrub lucerne or tagastaste or something? I don't remember exactly, but it's kind of a plant that's more like a bush, but it has comparable nutritional value to alfalfa. And he wanted to put trees in that to drop pods. So animals would graze the low protein forage, browse the high protein shrub, and then by the end of the season, when the honey locusts could drop pods, they would have this high energy feed stuff. There's like a concentrate feed that they could fatten those animals off on. That was his goal, his concept. Whether he's made success or been successful with that or not, I do not know. I haven't heard from him in years. But sure. I think that there are ways to design these systems. Challenge is the time, and another challenge is the land tenure. If you're doing this on a farm that you rent, well, good luck at planting a tree that you want to get something out of 10 or 15 years from now if your landlord won't give you more than a year-to-year lease. I mean, it's just not, people are not going to make that investment.
Yeah. Yeah. So silvopasture systems are so inherently complicated just because it is a full system, and, it is management specific and management unique, and it's all fairly high management typically. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I would say for our silvopastures that we have in place now, I don't think of them as particularly high maintenance. It's more maintenance with the fencing because we've got a bunch of experimental units. But those trees are up and they have accommodated mature cows and sheep and whatnot, and it's not that big of a deal.
I should caveat that to say establishment phase is high maintenance. Is where
Yep. Yep. I mean, you got to be willing to bear that. There's just no question until we have some genius shows us how else to do it. And I think when is onto some of that from the standpoint of, using the tree tubes and stakes as part of the fencing system and that sort of thing. I think that's a very reasonable approach to reduce some of your labor.
Got a straightforward question for you. What was the
That'd
name?
be nice.
You're welcome. What was the name of the study comparing endophyte fescue with shade trees to novel fescue without?
It's not in the literature. It's the work was done by Rob Kallenbach at the University of Missouri, and I often present his data. And if I've got time when we're done here, I'll fumble through my slides if you want to hang on, and I'll show it to you.
How do you spell Kallenbach?
Kallenbach.
And you said you of Missouri?
Yes, he's now in administration, but this was they had some kind of videos, I think, from the Agroforestry Center years ago, and he was talking about kind of climate smart agriculture or whatever, and so that was something he presented at that time.
All right. Okay, let me hop back into some of these other questions. So we talked about this. You talked about this briefly, but I'll pitch you the actual full question. What would be considered too dense for optimal pasture growth under my trees? Let's say I'm planting trees with a 40-foot spread. How should I think about spacing them in row and between row if I want to maximize my trees, but not lose forage production? And do you have a recommended number of trees per acre?
Yeah, I'm working on that for some of these grants, and I don't really have an answer to that because so here's a question. So one of the people that planted Silvopasture in Virginia, we were talking to, and he said he was talking with his buddy who works at the feed store, and they said, well, how are you going to do this? And he was talking about what he was saying. Well, we can't get through with our, I don't remember if it was a spray rig or fertilizer truck or whatever it was. And so he's like, oh, well, okay, I'll make the alleys wider. So if I come in and say, well, make a 40-foot alley, plan on 40 by 40 spacing, kind of like what we've done here in Virginia, that'd be perfect. That's not going to work for you if you need some other kind of farm management that's going to require you to take larger equipment through the system. So I just don't go there. I guess in my experience, and it's not, particularly scientific. I tend to think about, 25, 35 trees to the acre or something like that from a kind of a hardwood standpoint. And so, 40 by 40 foot spacing, that kind of gets you into that ballpark. But again, what was done in Virginia for our site was an 8 by 40 with some expectation to thin them out over time. And that, maybe you want to do that if you're thinking, well, I'm going to have some of these trees that are going to have some sort of value down the road. Maybe it's for nut production, and you want to see which ones you think look like. Maybe they're precocious bearers, but I really don't know much about selecting trees for nut production. But maybe you want to look at ones you think which ones have a little better nut bearing qualities on the front end. So the other ones that don't get gone, or maybe it's not walnuts. Maybe it could be pecans or hickory nuts or whatever it is. So I'm really reluctant, just given all these kind of different approaches, to say this is the way you should do it. When it comes to thinning an existing stand, I think particularly with hardwoods, they can be very stressed by it. Pines probably too, but I just don't. I can see the stress more readily with a hardwood when you do a heavy thinning. And so if that's if it's a fairly young stand, maybe it's kind of regrowth and it's maybe 10, 15 years old, then maybe you can thin fairly heavily and it doesn't really matter. And you can get yourself to you can select the trees that you want, assuming you have decent species and rock and roll. But if this stand is fairly mature, and you want to get down to that, again, let's don't talk about stem numbers. Let's talk about kind of 50% light. If you want to get down to that or up to that 50% light in the understory, or even a little bit higher, if you tried to do all of that at one time, your logger would thank you, and it would be better financially, if you're having to pay a logger to do it. But your trees will be shocked by that. And so, I'm more inclined to say, in a thinning kind of operation for more mature trees, I'd probably be thinking more like, well, let's do a third of it now and give them a couple of years and come back and do another third of it.
Mhm.
But that may not work financially. So, I mean, I think
Yeah.
you're always, and what species do you have? Because if it's white oak, they're going to be more subject to this epicormic branching and show those kinds of stresses, compared with some other species, which maybe are less sensitive to that. So my recommendation, particularly on the thinning side, is to, and even on the planting side, is to build a team. Who are all the people that are going to come across that farm as part of the normal operations? This is where I'd like to put these trees. This is the species I'm thinking about. Work with a forester to say, is that a good species for this site or not? Or if you're thinning, I want to thin, I want to have high quality trees left over. What can I do with this? In some cases, you may have to do a silvopasture in conjunction with, say, a harvest somewhere else to make it workable for the logger. There's lots of things to consider. And that's one of the first recommendations that we put into our extension publications about this stuff is, if you're gonna do this, it's a good idea to work with a team, people that have expertise that you probably don't have, or people that are just on your farm and may give you a perspective, again, like machinery that you may not think of right offhand. So sorry, I'm not answering your question, but that's best I can do.
They're complex questions. There's a reason the answers sound like that. So I think that's totally fair. We're approaching the end of our session. I have a couple more I want to throw at you. Can you stay 5 minutes over, John?
Sure, I will. I was just trying to look through
okay. I have three more questions. But we're gonna take 1 minute for each of them. How's that sound?
All right, do what you can.
I'm gonna nail you down. Okay. How long before adding animals into a newly seeded pasture, like a woodland conversion project? How long before you can get the animals in there once you've seeded?
Well, a lot of times you're probably thinking about, depending on when you seeded it and how well it's grown, you're probably talking minimum 6 months. It may be a year. I think kind of better rule of thumb might be to just evaluate the plants. And, if you're tugging at them and they give you significant resistance and you think an animal is not going to pull it out of the ground, then it's probably okay. But, if you've got lots of open space between plants, my sense would be to graze lightly.
Mm-hmm. That's smart. The tug test. I like that. It's very common sense. All right. This is a situational question someone's asking, but we're going to give it a quick answer. I've got some woods that I don't use. A forester told me the woods would need more light to regenerate valuable trees. Since I'm not using my woods and I also don't have enough area to graze, I'd like to fence my animals into my woods. I've heard some people say it was a good idea and some people say it was a terrible idea. What do you think? And if it's a bad idea, why?
So I have no problem fencing the woods and running animals through it. I have a problem with fencing the woods, putting the animals on it, and walking away. My sense of silvopastoral systems is that they need management and more so than just your standard pasture. You see overgrazed pastures all the time, and we think, well, that's just kind of the way it is. And we see animals in the woodlot, and they can do a lot of damage, right? in neither scenario is it good to just leave the animals there, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in the context of trees, it's, we're used to seeing the pastures being overgrazed. In the context of trees, for a couple of generations now, we've said fence the woods and keep the cattle out of that. And if you go in and just let the animals have free reign there, and you get a lot of tree damage, then that's going to be highly visible, and people say, "What a stupid idea that was." So, I guess again, I have no problem with running animals through, but if there's not a lot of forages there, I either need to have hay spread out across the environment so that it's not a situation where they're congregating in one spot and doing a bunch of damage in that one spot, but they are moving around the site, and they don't stay there for long. And my sense would be that so let's say year one, you're going to have not a whole lot of grazing days. Year two, you may pick up a few more grazing days, just because that kind of management. There's an old NRCS guy that used to say, manage for what you want, and it'll be there. So the context is, if I'm managing it for silvopasture, then over time, I'm going to get those forages in there. I mean, simply feeding hay with some grass seed in there is going to help do that for you. So again, I'm giving the "it depends" kind of answer here.
All right, complex systems. All right, last question. Is there anything you'd like to see folks experiment with more? What tree or shrub do you see as underappreciated and is just waiting for someone to make good use of it?
Well, I mentioned willow as a possibility. Yeah, we have a list of about 20 trees that we think might make reasonable trees for silvopasture in the Mid-Atlantic, and I dare say there's probably research with 2 or 3 or 4 of the species that are on that list. I really think yellow poplar has a lot of opportunity. And maybe you have a system with mast type trees like oaks and hickory and that sort of thing that are slow growing, and you put some corresponding hardwoods in there that are not so much mass producers, but they're fairly rapidly growing, and they can be harvested in time. And I think yellow poplar might fit that bill. So there's a couple of examples right off the bat. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, folks, we are out of time. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Stesha, I'm going to ask you to drop a few of these closing links in the chat. This recording is going to go up onto ASD's YouTube page, as I mentioned. So feel free to just follow that channel, and you'll get alerted when they come up. If you are interested in propagating from trees from seed, definitely come to that next session with Sean Dombrowski. And Stesh, if you want to drop that questions link into the chat too. If you have a burning question about tree propagation, get it on the roster early, and then we'll be sure to cover it if possible. And then last but not least, if you are interested in making a donation to ASD to keep this kind of programming free and fun and accessible, you can do that. You can do that at the same page where you registered for your tickets tonight. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate y'all being here. John, I just want to say thanks again for your time and being so generous with all your information, and a couple lovely comments here. Says, thank you, John and Emilie, for another great webinar. Excellent information. Thanks, John. And Fran's going to join us again next time, so we'll be seeing her.
Very good. I'm sorry, sorry I didn't get to that slide with the fescue and the shade issues, but maybe that's something for later.
And if folks want to find you, John, how can they do that?
Well, Fike, Virginia Tech, Fike, Silvopasture, jfike at vt.edu, any of those.
Okay, excellent. I'll throw that in here, jfike at VT. All right, thanks everybody. Have a great night. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.